In just a few months, Mexico, the largest dairy customer of the United States, has quietly turned its back, handing market share to Canada. Not because of lower prices, but because of something the U.S. is rapidly losing: trust. In this new milk war, transparency and ethics have become weapons, and Canada is using them to push the U.S. off the North American agricultural table. Mexico's shift. The silent turning point of the North American dairy chessboard. There were no drum rolls nor the flash of signing ceremonies. Yet one of the quietest changes is shaking the North American agricultural market. From the highways carrying milk from Wisconsin and Ohio down to Guadalajara, to the seaports once serving as gateways for American products into Mexico, that flow is slowing down. In its place, a new supply source, from Canada, is quietly taking over. And more importantly, this is not just a simple trade swap, but a warning about how economic power can slip from a superpower's hands without them even realizing it. Mexico has long been considered a close friend in America's agricultural trade chessboard. For decades, U.S. milk has been the almost default choice on the tables of millions of Mexican families. A relationship built on geographic convenience, competitive pricing, and preferential trade agreements. But all those advantages began to crack when Washington decided to impose a 25% tariff on imports from Mexico in February 2025, as part of a tougher strategy toward its neighbor. This decision was not just an economic measure. It was a political signal, and Mexico received that message loud and clear. In this context, Canada, a country that had long stood on the fringes of Mexico's dairy market, saw an opening. Without loud announcements or flashy promotional campaigns, they chose a quiet yet calculated approach, step by step meeting Mexico's new demands for cleaner, more transparent, and more reliable supply chains. As U.S. tariff policy drove up the price of milk imports from north of the Rio Grande, Canada quickly offered stable pricing, along with the quality commitments Mexico was looking for. This shift has taken place almost in silence, yet its consequences echo loudly. For American farmers, who have long been accustomed to steady revenue from the Mexican market, this is nothing less than a blow to their confidence. When a major market walks away from you, it's not just sales that drop, it's also the belief in your irreplaceability that starts to crumble. U.S. agricultural associations are beginning to feel the pressure. Losing a customer like Mexico is not just losing a contract, but losing a strategic link in the regional trade chain. What makes this situation even more serious is the element of market psychology. Mexico has not publicly declared a cutoff with the U.S., but its purchasing actions have sent a cold signal. They no longer see the U.S. as the sole or even top priority supplier. Once this message spreads, other markets, which are watching closely, will begin to ask themselves, if Mexico can shift so quickly, why can't we? Politically, this event exposes a hard truth for Washington. Trade advantages once considered automatic have now become something to be fought for. In a global economic environment where each tariff decision or import standard can be interpreted as a diplomatic message, losing trust can bring far-reaching consequences beyond any statistical figure. Notably, Mexico is not just seeking a new supply source because of price or pure politics. They are adjusting their import strategy to reflect changes in the needs of their own consumers. Mexico's middle class is growing rapidly, and with it, an awareness of quality, food safety, and ethical factors in production. When Canada appeared with a transparent track record and strict control systems, they immediately became a more attractive choice, despite their market share still being smaller than America's. For the U.S., this is a costly lesson. A market cannot be maintained forever on geography and history alone. Trade relationships, like any relationship, must be sustained through continuous attention, adaptability, and respect for the partner's needs. When a country allows domestic policy, such as tariffs, to inadvertently damage foreign relations, that gap will be quickly filled by a competitor. And in this case, Canada has done so almost perfectly. Mexico's shift is not just a lost deal, it is a sign of a trend. America's traditional partners are ready to seek alternatives if they feel overlooked or their interests are no longer guaranteed. It is a reminder that economic power, like political power, can be eroded from the smallest cracks. And when that happens, the loss often unfolds in silence, until it is too late to reverse. Canada and the golden formula of trust. If Mexico's pivot away from the U.S. reveals a power vacuum taking shape, then the way Canada fills that gap is a clear testament to the strength of long-term strategy. It is no coincidence that Ottawa has been able to break into a market dominated by the U.S. for decades. They had been preparing for a long time, through steadfast policies, a distinct production philosophy, and, most importantly, an understanding that in the new era, milk is not just an agricultural product, it is a story to sell. From the very first days of 2025, Canada rolled out a set of production standards that many countries were still debating on paper. A total ban on artificial growth hormones, strict limits on antibiotic use, and a requirement that all feed for dairy herds be plant-based, things that once seemed to exist only in environmental advocacy reports, became mandatory law. This was not a short-term greenwashing campaign. It was the result of years of discussions between the government, farmers' associations, and scientists, creating a framework that any farm wishing to survive must comply with. But what set Canada apart was not only setting standards, but turning those standards into a competitive edge. In April 2025, the ProAction Traceability system officially went nationwide, integrating with Dairy Trace and Simply Trace, allowing detailed tracking of each individual cow, from birth date, vaccination records, diet, to housing conditions. For every liter of milk exported, the importer can scan a code and know exactly which farm it came from, which region, and even view the care history of the herd there. This may sound like a technical detail, but in a global consumer climate increasingly sensitive to the concept of ethical consumption, it is exactly what makes the difference. When a mother in Mexico holds a carton of Canadian milk, she is not just buying a nutritional product, she is buying the assurance that her child is drinking milk from cows raised without toxins, without drug abuse, and cared for in clean environments. The remarkable thing is that Canada does not advertise loudly. They let the numbers and data speak. Transparent reports are published regularly, open for both the public and international partners to access. When Mexican importers looked for alternative suppliers, they didn't just see prices and volumes, they saw a system ready to prove every stage of production. This is where the U.S. struggles to keep up. While Canada has established agricultural data networks as a form of national infrastructure, much of the U.S. dairy industry still operates on batch-level tracking, lacking detailed information for each animal, and is almost unable to meet a partner's rapid verification requirements. As a result, when Mexico raised its import standards to prioritize goods with clear, ethical profiles, Canada stepped in as the obvious choice, while the U.S. was pushed into a defensive position. Canada's success lies not just in meeting buyers' requirements, but in moving ahead even before those requirements became law. Ottawa understands that the global market is shifting toward valuing transparency and sustainability. Instead of waiting to be forced to change, they proactively raised standards and turned them into a national brand. When Mexico sought a supplier that could guarantee both quality and image, Canada did not need to scramble. They were already there, with a clean record and a verified supply chain. This strategy creates a chain reaction. Once trust is built in a key market like Mexico, it becomes living proof to conquer others. Middle Eastern, Asian, and European countries, also increasing their demands for agricultural transparency, will look to Mexico as a successful case study, and are highly likely to open their doors to Canada with fewer barriers. In a world where agricultural competition is increasingly fierce, Canada has proven something that sounds simple, but not everyone can do. Instead of chasing low prices and high output, invest in trust. Because when consumers trust, they are willing to pay more, and when partners trust, they are willing to stay for the long term. This is what the U.S. is losing, and Canada is seizing every opportunity to strengthen. If in the previous section the story was about Mexico turning its back on the U.S., then here the message is even clearer. Canada did not just luck into picking up dropped market share. They prepared so that when the opportunity arose, they not only stepped in, but locked the door behind them. In the new milk war, that is how a sideline player becomes a heavyweight contender, using the simplest weapon of all: trust built from the ground up. The U.S. and the trust gap in traceability. If Canada has built a solid fortress with transparent data, the U.S. is still struggling with a traceability system that resembles a map missing half its place names. It's a bitter paradox. A nation leading the world in technology, AI, and logistics, yet failing to tell a complete story about the very gallons of milk it produces. The current traceability structure of the U.S. dairy industry largely relies on a batch tracking system, tracking by production lot. In other words, when a container of milk leaves the warehouse, the attached information only indicates which plant it came from, at what time, and that it was processed from milk sourced from multiple farms in the same lot. But if you want to know which specific cow produced that milk, what it ate, what medications it received, and the condition of its barn, the answer would be cannot be determined. This isn't just a technical problem, it's a gap in trust. In an era when customers, from importers to consumers, demand transparent data for every stage, the U.S. system is like an accounting book that only records totals while skipping individual transactions. It may have sufficed in the old days, but it's become outdated in the face of the new standards of the global market. The problem becomes more serious when competitors, especially Canada, have turned detailed traceability into a marketing weapon. When a Mexican importer can scan the code on a Canadian product and see the entire life record of the herd, while a U.S. product offers only a vague lot number, the comparison becomes glaringly obvious. Trust is not only eroded, it is replaced by suspicion. The clearest illustration of this lag came in early 2025 when a shipment of U.S. milk powder was rejected by Mexico right at the port for failing to meet traceability requirements. The U.S. side insisted the product met safety standards, but could not provide detailed proof of the origin of every liter of milk in the shipment. Meanwhile, Canada quickly filled the gap, sending Mexico a replacement shipment with full farm data and images, approved in less than 48 hours. The root cause lies not only in technology, but in the structure of the U.S. dairy industry. It's a massive system, with tens of thousands of farms of varying sizes scattered across different states, operating under different state standards, and heavily influenced by cost-cutting pressures. Investing in a detailed traceability system requires significant upfront costs, while many producers still believe that product quality alone is enough to retain customers. They have underestimated how quickly quality is being redefined. Because, in the new context, quality is not just about taste, nutritional content, or microbiological safety. It's also the story of the product, a story customers can verify in every detail. And if that story lacks data, the market will write the rest with suspicion. Adding to this, the policy divide between the federal and state levels slows progress in improving traceability. Some advanced states, like California, have experimented with expanded traceability systems, but the scope is limited to within the state, failing to create a unified nationwide standard. Meanwhile, exporters need a single standard to meet international market requirements. As a result, the U.S. dairy industry enters the milk war with mismatched armor, leaving many critical gaps exposed. Worse, this gap doesn't just lose contracts, it erodes the U.S. quality standard image that has been built over decades. In international trade, national brand image is an intangible but immensely valuable asset. Lose it, and businesses will have to compete purely on price. A game the U.S. doesn't want to play, as its production costs are much higher than many other countries. Therefore, as Canada advances with cow profiles and instant traceability systems, the U.S. faces a thorny question. Will it dare to dismantle the old structure and rebuild from scratch? Or will it keep patching and accept gradually losing its markets? In political economy, delaying reform often means losing power. And in the current milk war, that could turn the U.S. from a dominant player into a follower in just a few short years, when Mexicans choose trust over cheap prices. If in the past, Mexican consumers often considered price first, in recent years, that priority has changed quietly but decisively. The young urban generation, those who grew up with social media, global information, and environmental movements, are now willing to pay more for products they believe are clean and ethical. Milk is no longer just a drink, but a statement about a way of life. This has created an important cultural shift in consumption, from seeking products that are tasty and cheap to those that are tasty and transparent. A household in Guadalajara might overlook an American brand that is several pesos cheaper, just to buy Canadian milk with packaging printed with a QR code leading to a video filmed at the farm, where they see cows eating green grass, not confined in tight spaces and not injected with growth hormones. In the eyes of the buyer, that is vivid evidence and an undeniable commitment. The key point is that this trust is not built through advertising, but through the ability to verify directly. Canada has turned traceability into an interactive experience. Consumers scan the code themselves, view the data themselves, and make their own judgments. This changes the relationship between the buyer and the product, from passively trusting the brand to actively verifying the truth. When control belongs to the customer, the brand that provides the most data will gain the advantage. In contrast, American dairy products enter the Mexican market with a psychological disadvantage: the lack of a transparent story. They can still claim that the product is safe, but in the information age, "trust me" is no longer convincing enough. The new generation of consumers doesn't want to hear promises. They want proof. And when they cannot see the production process, they will assume that something is being hidden, even if that's not actually the case. This trend is further fueled by social movements in Mexico. Animal welfare organizations, environmental groups, and campaigns against the abuse of antibiotics in livestock farming have spread strongly on social media. Many Mexicans have begun to directly link consumption to social responsibility. Drinking a glass of milk is not just a personal act, but part of a chain of impacts on animals, the environment, and public health. This is when the ethical factor becomes a competitive advantage. Canada is not just selling milk. They are selling an image of humane, clean, and sustainable agriculture. That image aligns with the values that the new Mexican consumers are seeking. The U.S., despite its enormous production capacity, has yet to reposition its brand in this direction. The result is that on the same store shelf, Canadian products are assumed to be trustworthy, while American products have to explain a lot, and often fail, to reach the same level of trust. This consumer pivot is also a broader warning. In the modern market, cheap prices are no longer an absolute shield. As consumers' income and awareness rise, they are willing to pay more for products that align with their personal values, especially in the food industry where safety, environmental, and ethical factors are closely intertwined. Any brand that fails to adapt will be left behind, regardless of its size or history. Mexico is just a typical example. If the U.S. does not change, this trend will repeat in other markets, from Europe to Asia, where the middle class is emerging along with the demand for responsible consumption. And then, losing Mexico will no longer be a single trade incident, but the beginning of a chain of strategic losses. Pressure weighing heavily on American farmers. As dairy export contracts to Mexico gradually shrink, the concern is not just about trade figures in the U.S. Department of Agriculture's reports. It is the real pain in rural America, where family farms that have struggled for years now see their market shrink even further. Every canceled shipment, every returned container is a direct blow to their already fragile cash flow. In the U.S. dairy industry, profit margins have long been tight. Milk prices are under pressure from domestic competition and large supermarket chains, while production costs continue to rise, from livestock feed, labor, to energy. When exports decline, farmers not only lose an important source of income, but also have to shoulder additional inventory, leading to forced sell-offs at prices lower than production costs. This is a dangerous spiral. The more they sell at a loss, the less ability they have to invest in improving quality or traceability systems, something the global market increasingly demands. Family farms, long a symbol of American agriculture, are the most severely hurt. Unlike giant agribusiness corporations, they do not have a deep reserve fund to withstand months of declining revenue. When banks start tightening credit and demanding more collateral, many families are forced to sell land, sell their herds, and shut down operations after generations in the business. Each time a farm closes, it's not just the loss of a few jobs, but the loss of a part of the social and economic structure of the entire local community. The impact reaches beyond statistical figures. In Midwestern and Northeastern states, where dairy is the backbone industry, the drop in production weakens the entire value chain. Processing plants must cut capacity. Transportation companies lose contracts. Feed and farm supply stores lose customers. As local economies are gradually drained, towns already facing population decline find it even harder to attract and retain young people. The loss is also about trust. For decades, American farmers have been encouraged to believe that producing more for less was the key to winning in the international market. But now, seeing Canada, a country that produces less but sells at higher prices and wins market share through transparency and high standards, many farmers feel left behind without a clear strategy to adapt. The feeling of being abandoned by support policies and trade direction is spreading, creating political pressure at both state and federal levels. The bitter truth is, many farmers know well that without change, they will continue to lose markets. But change means major investments in technology, processes, and certifications, something that, given the current financial situation, is almost a luxury. Thus, a vicious cycle forms, lacking capital to upgrade standards, leading to weaker competitiveness, which results in more lost market share and then even less capital. In the bigger picture, losing the Mexican market is not just a trade story, but a wake-up call about the sustainability of the American agricultural model. Without a strategy to rebuild trust and upgrade standards from the ground up, what is happening today may be just the beginning of a long-term decline, not only economically, but also in the very agricultural identity of this nation. Canada, a fortress of stability amid rough seas. While American farmers struggle with shrinking markets and volatile prices, to the north, Canadian farmers stand firm like a fortress amid rough seas. Their secret does not lie in producing more or selling cheaper, but in a cleverly designed domestic protection mechanism, a system of quotas, price insurance, and production control. This system operates like a shield. The Canadian government limits milk production based on the actual demand of the domestic and international markets, avoiding the surplus that would cause prices to crash. Each farmer is assigned a specific quota, equivalent to the right to produce and sell a certain amount of milk each year. No one can undercut prices by mass overproduction, and no one is pushed into distress selling to survive. As a result, milk prices in Canada are maintained at a level that ensures consumers do not feel squeezed, while still guaranteeing stable profits for producers. Notably, this policy is not just an economic tool, but also a social contract between farmers, the state, and consumers. Canadians accept paying a little more for domestic milk in exchange for safe, transparent products and a sustainable agricultural sector. Farmers do not need to engage in an exhausting output race. Instead, they can invest in quality, animal welfare, and advanced traceability technology, factors that are increasingly decisive in international competitiveness. This stability creates a clear contrast when comparing the two pictures along the US-Canada border. In the US, milk prices fluctuate sharply, and farmers can suffer heavy losses within months due to oversupply or falling exports. In Canada, prices are kept at pre-agreed levels, and farmers know exactly how much they will receive, allowing them to plan long-term finances. This is especially important in a rapidly changing global consumption trend, when demand shifts from more and cheaper to less, but of higher quality and transparency. The protection system also serves as a natural filter against external shocks. When the U.S. imposed a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum from Mexico, prompting Mexico to retaliate with tariffs on U.S. dairy, Canada's dairy industry hardly wavered. Their market share in Mexico even increased, as they were not directly affected by the tariff standoff between the two large economies. This is an advantage that the absolute free trade model, the path the U.S. has chosen, cannot provide to farmers. However, Canada's stability is not accidental, but the result of decades of maintaining a clear philosophy. Agriculture is not just a business, but also national security and a social foundation. Amid global trade volatility and competitive pressure from low-cost producing countries, they remain steadfast with the slow but steady strategy. This is precisely what has created soft power. When Mexico needs a reliable supply source, Canada emerges as the ideal partner, not only delivering on time, but also bringing the image of a responsible, stable, and long-term trustworthy agricultural sector. If the U.S. continues to persist with the model of producing as much as possible, selling as cheaply as possible, without building protective barriers for producers, this game will become increasingly disadvantageous. Meanwhile, Canada, with its protective shield and stable foundation, continues to advance as a hard-to-displace competitor, even with much smaller output. Mexican market. Canada's new power lever. With its domestic market protected by a solid layer of armor, Canada did not stop at self-defense. They understand that in the global agricultural power game, whoever controls key markets will control the trade balance. And Mexico, a nation of more than 130 million people with steadily growing demand for milk and dairy products, is the strategic piece. The opportunity came when the U.S.-Mexico trade relationship began to show cracks. Retaliatory tariffs, along with the U.S.'s constant shifts in trade stance, made Mexican importers realize that putting all their eggs in the U.S. basket was a risky gamble. Canada immediately stepped in, not with flowery advertisements, but with a commitment to stability, transparency, and strict adherence to quality standards. Instead of lowering prices to compete, Canada took the opposite route, keeping prices at a level that reflects costs and quality, but offering long-term contracts, on-time delivery, and full traceability throughout the entire production chain. This struck a chord with Mexican importers who were already weary of U.S. price shocks. For them, a stable supply is worth more than saving a few percent in costs. Canada's growing presence in Mexico is not just about selling more milk. It is gradually becoming a soft power tool, helping Canada strengthen its position in international trade negotiations. When a large market like Mexico grows increasingly dependent on Canadian supply, the balance of influence among North American countries begins to shift. Notably, Canada has skillfully woven political and social elements into its trade strategy. They are not only selling milk, but also selling the image of a nation that respects the rules, values food safety, and protects farmers' rights. This makes trade agreements involving Canada often receive goodwill from partners, because the other side knows they are working with a trustworthy partner who is not likely to use tariffs or short-term policies as bargaining tools. For the U.S., losing market share in Mexico is not just about losing immediate revenue. It is also a signal that their economic and political influence in the region is eroding. When neighboring countries turn to Canada as an alternative partner, America's weight in shaping trade rules will gradually diminish. And once they lose the position of being the default supplier, regaining it will be no easy task, because agricultural trade is always tied to long-term trust, not just prices at a given moment. Canada understands this well, and they are taking advantage of every gap the U.S. leaves behind. Quietly, without fanfare, they are step-by-step penetrating deeper into distribution systems, building stable contract networks, and strengthening the image of Mexico's trusted friend. In this long game, speed matters less than endurance, and that is Canada's greatest advantage. If the U.S. continues to underestimate the role of trust and stability in trade, Mexico may only be the beginning. Once Canada's strategy is replicated in other markets, the landscape of the North American dairy industry will no longer be the same, and the U.S. will have to learn to play a game that their rival has been planning for a very long time.